The Ghost of Nguyen Thi Lan, the female sniper who terrorized US forces and her incredible story. Welcome to Hidden Vietnam History. Tonight we're diving into a story so incredible, so carefully hidden by both sides of the war, that it sounds like fiction, but every bullet fired, every life taken, every impossible shot made from distances that shouldn't be possible, all of it is documented, classified, and absolutely true. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button if you want to discover the hidden stories they don't teach in history books. Like this video if you enjoy deep dives into the untold chapters of Vietnam, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing our global community of history seekers. Now turn down the lights, get comfortable, because tonight we're meeting Nguyen Thi Lan, the woman who single-handedly changed American military doctrine, forced the Pentagon to rewrite their field manuals, and killed more enemy soldiers than any sniper in recorded history. Her story was so effective that both the Vietnamese government and the US military agreed to bury it for 50 years. This is the story of the ghost of Nguyen Thi Lan. And if Netflix made this into a series, you'd think they were exaggerating. Chapter 1. The Village Girl Who Became Death. The story begins in a rice farming village called Phuoc Heap, 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon, March 1965. The American military presence in Vietnam was still relatively small. Just 23,000 military advisors who weren't supposed to be in combat roles. But Nguyen Thi Lan already knew better. Lan was 17 years old when the first helicopter landed in her village. She was small for her age, barely 5 feet tall, maybe 90 pounds soaking wet. Her hands, calloused from years of rice planting, looked like they belonged to a child, but her eyes belonged to someone who had already seen too much. The Americans came that morning looking for Viet Cong sympathizers. They found a village full of farmers who had the misfortune of living in a strategic location between Saigon and the Nguyen Thi Lan tunnels. The operation was supposed to be routine. Search the village, check for weapons caches, leave. What happened instead changed everything. The search turned violent when the Americans found a cache of rice that they suspected was meant for Viet Cong fighters. In the chaos that followed, 23 villagers were killed. Among them, Lan's parents, her 2 younger brothers and her grandmother, who had raised her after her father died in the French War. The official army report, declassified in 2015, described it as an unfortunate incident resulting from hostile fire from concealed positions. The truth, buried in classified after-action reports, was darker. There had been no hostile fire, no concealed positions, just frightened farmers and trigger-happy soldiers who mistook an old man's walking stick for a weapon. Lan survived because she was hiding in the family's grain storage pit when the shooting started. For 6 hours she lay motionless under rice stalks while soldiers walked over her head. She listened to her mother calling for help. She heard her youngest brother crying. She heard both sounds stop. When the helicopters finally left, Lan emerged into a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. Her family was gone, her village was gone, but she was alive, and in that moment of absolute loss, something crystallized inside her. A clarity so sharp it could cut through steel. She walked north toward the Nguyen Thi Lan tunnels, carrying nothing but her father's old hunting rifle and a promise written in blood and rice paddies. The Americans had made her into something they couldn't understand, something they weren't prepared to fight. They had created their own nightmare. Chapter 2. The Underground University. The Nguyen Thi Lan tunnel complex in 1965 was already the stuff of legend. Over 50 kilometers of underground passages, chambers, workshops, hospitals, and living quarters carved into the red clay beneath the jungle floor. What most people don't know is that it was also a university, the most effective military training facility in modern history. Lan arrived at the tunnels 3 days after the massacre. She was dehydrated, exhausted, and carrying a rifle that was older than she was. The Viet Cong sentries who found her almost sent her away. They had enough problems without adding traumatized teenage girls to their roster. But Captain Vo Tran noticed something the sentries had missed. When he asked Lan about her family's hunting rifle, she could field strip it in complete darkness. She could estimate windage and elevation by feel. She could name the effective range of every cartridge her father had ever used. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My father hunted to keep us alive during the French occupation," she said. "He taught me that missing means your family goes hungry." Captain Vaux had trained snipers before. He recognized natural ability when he saw it, but more importantly, he recognized something else in Lan's eyes. The kind of focused hatred that could be refined into a precision instrument. The training began immediately. The Vietnamese approach to sniper training was unlike anything the Americans had encountered, where Western military doctrine emphasized long-range marksmanship and technical precision. The Vietnamese focused on patience, camouflage, and psychological warfare. Their snipers didn't just kill, they demoralized, disrupted, and created terror disproportionate to their numbers. Lan's instructors were legendary figures who had been fighting invaders for 20 years. Master Sergeant Le Van Duc had killed French officers from distances they thought impossible. Senior sniper Tran Kim Phuong had perfected the art of urban warfare. During the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they taught Lan everything: ballistics, weather reading, stalking, concealment, escape routes, and most importantly, the psychology of fear. A sniper's most powerful weapon isn't the rifle, Sergeant Lefebvre. It's uncertainty. When the enemy knows you're there but can't find you, you own their minds. Lan absorbed every lesson with the intensity of someone who had already paid the price for ignorance. She practiced moving through jungle undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf. She learned to read wind patterns by watching grass move 200 meters away. She mastered the art of creating concealed firing positions that were invisible even from 10 feet away. But the most important lesson was patience. Vietnamese snipers might wait days for a single shot. They would observe enemy patterns, study individual soldiers, learn their habits and routines before selecting targets. This wasn't random violence, it was warfare as art form. Lan's graduation exercise was brutal in its simplicity. She had to infiltrate an American forward operating base, observe their routines for 48 hours without being detected, and identify the 3 highest value targets based on their behavior and equipment. She succeeded so completely that the base commander never knew she had been there. Chapter 3. The First Kill. November 15, 1965, Phi Base Delta, 12 kilometers southeast of Quechua. Second Lieutenant Michael Harrison from Kansas was 3 months into his tour of duty, and starting to believe he might actually survive Vietnam. He was 22 years old, engaged to his high school sweetheart, and counting days until he could rotate home. He never saw Lan. The shot came from nearly 600 meters away, a distance that American intelligence considered impossible for Viet Cong snipers. Harrison was inspecting a communication antenna when the bullet, fired from a concealed position in a tree line that had been cleared by artillery 3 days earlier, took him in the center of his chest. The medics reached him in under a minute. He was still alive, still conscious, asking about his men and whether the antenna was secure. He died talking about the letter he was writing to his fiancée. The shot wasn't just tactically perfect, it was psychologically devastating. Harrison was well liked by his men, one of those officers who actually cared about the soldiers under his command. His death hit the unit harder than losing 10 random grunts would have. Lan watched through her scope as the Americans reacted. She noted which soldiers took command, who maintained discipline, who panicked. She memorized faces, equipment, behavioral patterns. Then she disappeared into the jungle like smoke. The American response was predictable and counterproductive. They artillery bombarded the entire tree line where they thought the shot originated. They sent out patrols to search for signs of enemy snipers. They implemented new security protocols that made their own movements more predictable. They never found a trace of Lan because she had never been in the tree line. Her actual firing position was in a camouflaged spider hole 400 meters to the north, angled to create the illusion that the shot came from the wood. By the time they started looking for her, she was back underground, planning her next operation. The psychological effect of Harrison's death rippled through the entire division.
Soldiers who had been careless about cover became obsessively cautious. Officers who had developed predictable routines started varying their movements. The simple fact that someone could reach out and kill them from distances they thought were safe changed everything about how they operated. Lan had fired one bullet and altered the behavior of 3,000. Chapter 4. The Invisible War. Over the next 18 months, Lan became something beyond a sniper. She became a force of nature. Her kill count climbed steadily. Officers, radio operators, machine gunners, medics, and anyone else whose death would cause maximum disruption. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What made Lan legendary wasn't how many people she killed, but how she killed them. She perfected techniques that seem impossible until you understand the mathematics of fear and precision. She could fire from positions so close to American bases that search teams would walk past her hiding spot without detecting her. She developed camouflage methods that rendered her invisible even to soldiers looking directly at her location. Her most famous documented kill occurred at Firebase Charlie on March 8. Mitchell was inspecting defensive positions when Lan's bullet found him. The shot came from inside the Firebase perimeter, from a position that should have been impossible to occupy without being detected. The investigation afterward revealed that Lan had spent 4 days infiltrating the base, moving only at night, hiding during the day in a spider hole she had dug beneath a supply bunker. She had been living underneath them for nearly a week, studying their routines, selecting her target, waiting for the perfect moment. When Mitchell stepped into her kill zone, she took the shot from a distance of less than 100 meters, then escaped through the same tunnel system she had used to infiltrate. The psychological impact was devastating. If their own firebase wasn't safe, if the enemy could hide inside their perimeter for days without being detected, then nowhere was secure. Paranoia became epidemic. Soldiers started watching each other as suspiciously as they watched the jungle. But Lan's masterpiece wasn't a single kill. It was a campaign of psychological warfare that lasted 6 months and drove an entire battalion to the edge of madness. Chapter 5. The Phantom Campaign. Her target was the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, a unit that had been rotated to the Kyuchi area specifically because of their experience with counter-sniper operation. Instead of traditional sniping, Lan employed what she called the Long Fear, a systematic campaign designed to break the enemy's will without necessarily killing them. She would fire single shots at random times throughout the day and night, often missing deliberately but coming close enough to let the soldiers know they were being watched. She left calling cards, spent cartridges placed where American patrols would find them, sometimes with messages scratched into the brass. The messages were simple and terrifying. I know your face. I know where you sleep. I am always watching. She began taking personal items, a watch left beside a riverbank, a photograph dropped during a patrol, a letter from home that fell out of someone's pocket. These would reappear days later in places where soldiers would find them, often with bullet holes shot through them with surgical precision. The most psychologically devastating technique was her use of what she called appointment killing. She would leave a message telling a specific soldier that he would die at a specific time and place. Then she would wait at that location and fire a single shot, sometimes at the target, sometimes into the air, sometimes at a tree or rock nearby. The psychological effect was to make the entire war feel personal. This wasn't random combat. This was someone who knew them individually and was hunting them with patient, methodical precision. By September 1967, the 3rd Battalion was reporting the highest rates of psychological casualties in their division. Men were refusing to leave their bunkers. Patrol leaders were disobeying orders rather than enter areas where Lan was known to operate. The unit's combat effectiveness had degraded to the point where they were essentially useless. The Pentagon response was to classify the entire situation and transfer the battalion out of the area. Official reports blamed combat fatigue and environmental stress. The truth that a single teenage Vietnamese girl had broken an entire battalion through precision psychological warfare was buried so deeply that it didn't surface until the 1990s. Chapter 6. The Hunt for the Ghost. By early 1968, Lan had become the most wanted person in South Vietnam. The Americans had assigned an entire unit, Task Force Hunter, to finding and eliminating her. They brought in their best snipers, their most experienced trackers, their most sophisticated detection equipment. None of it worked. The problem was that Lan wasn't fighting like a conventional sniper. She was using the tunnel system, not just for concealment, but for mobility on a scale the Americans couldn't comprehend. She could fire from a position near Saigon and be back in the Cu Chi tunnels before American forces reached her last known location. Vietnamese civilians who had never supported the Viet Cong began providing intelligence about American movement. South Vietnamese army units that were supposed to be allied with the Americans began experiencing equipment failures and communication problems whenever operations were planned in areas where Lan was known to operate. The psychological warfare was working on a strategic level. American commanders found themselves making tactical decisions based not on military necessity, but on the desire to avoid giving Lan opportunities for high-profile kills. Entire operations were modified or cancelled because intelligence suggested she might be in the area. The hunt for her became a war within the war, consuming resources and manpower that should have been used for conventional operations. Special forces teams that should have been disrupting supply lines were instead playing an elaborate game of hide-and-seek with someone who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The closest they came to catching her was on February 14, 1968, Valentine's Day, which she chose deliberately because she knew American soldiers would be thinking about home. Chapter 7. The Valentine's Day Massacre. Established on high ground with clear fields of fire in all directions, surrounded by multiple layers of defensive positions, defended by an entire company of veteran soldiers who had been specifically trained in anti-sniper operations. She spent 2 weeks studying the base, learning the patrol schedules, identifying the weaknesses in their perimeter. She discovered that their confidence in the base's invulnerability had made them careless about certain basic security protocols. On February 13, she made her move, using a combination of tunnel entrance points and natural cover that the Americans hadn't properly secured. She positioned herself inside their defensive perimeter and waited. Her plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Instead of a single high-value kill, she was going to attempt something that had never been tried. Multiple kills from multiple positions in rapid succession, followed by an escape through the base itself. The killing began at dawn on Valentine's Day. Her first target was Captain Robert Chen, the officer in charge of perimeter security. The shot came from a position that should have been covered by 2 different watch posts. Chen died instantly, creating immediate confusion about where the threat was coming from. Before the Americans could react, Lan had moved to a second position and killed the radio operator who was trying to call for backup. Then she moved again and took out the sergeant who was organizing the response to the first shooting. In the space of 10 minutes, she had fired from 4 different positions inside their perimeter, killed 6 soldiers, and completely disrupted their command structure. Then she vanished. The search for her consumed the entire day. They found her spider holes, her ammunition caches, even some of her equipment, but they never found her. The investigation afterward revealed that she had escaped through a drainage culvert that led to a tunnel entrance 300 meters outside the base, a tunnel entrance that didn't appear on any of their intelligence maps. The Valentine's Day operation broke something in the American psyche. If she could penetrate their most secure position and kill their people almost at will, then what was the point of the security measures? What was the point of the war itself? More importantly, the operation proved that Lan had evolved from being just an individual sniper to being the operational center of a larger intelligence network. The precision of her infiltration, the accuracy of her intelligence about American positions, the sophistication of her escape route, all of it indicated that she had resources and support far beyond what a lone operative should have been able to access.
Chapter 8. The network revealed. The truth about Lan's operations was more remarkable than anyone had suspected. She wasn't working alone, and she wasn't even the most important person in her network. Declassified documents from both Vietnamese and American archives reveal that Lan was the visible component of an intelligence operation that involved hundreds of people across South Vietnam. Her kills were spectacular and got all the attention, but the real work was being done by an underground network of informants, support staff, and coordinators that had penetrated American military operations at every level. The network included South Vietnamese Army officers who provided intelligence about American troop movements, civilian contractors who worked on American bases, and could report on security measures, and even some American soldiers who had been turned either through blackmail or ideological conversion. Lan's sniper operations served as both propaganda and distraction. While American resources were being consumed in the hunt for her, the network was conducting far more significant operations: sabotage of supply lines, corruption of communications, manipulation of intelligence reports, and the systematic undermining of the psychological foundations of the American war effort. The most shocking revelation came in 1995, when former CIA operative Robert Manning published his memoir and revealed that American intelligence had known about the network since late 1967. They had identified most of the key players, understood how the operation worked, and developed plans to roll it up. By 1968, opinion polls were showing that American public support for the Vietnam War was declining rapidly. Military commanders were under pressure to show progress, to demonstrate that their strategies were working, to justify the sacrifices being made. The Lan network was actually helping with that propaganda effort. Every spectacular kill she made could be used to demonstrate the threat American soldiers were facing, the need for continued support from home, the importance of the mission they were undertaking. She was more valuable as an enemy than she would have been as a prisoner. So the hunt continued, the resources were expended, and the network operated with impunity, all because both sides had reasons to keep the war going rather than ending it. Chapter 9. The Tet Offensive and the End of the Ghost. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 changed everything about the Vietnam War, including the nature of Lan's mission. The coordinated attacks on cities throughout South Vietnam demonstrated that the Viet Cong had capabilities far beyond what American intelligence had estimated. But for Lan, Tet represented an opportunity to attempt something that had never been tried: the assassination of a major American political figure on Vietnamese soil. The target was General William Westmoreland, the commanding general of all American forces in Vietnam. Westmoreland was scheduled to make a morale-boosting visit to Firebase Bravo on February 15. Lan would infiltrate the firebase during the confusion of the Tet fighting, position herself for the shot during Westmoreland's visit, eliminate him in front of his own soldiers and the news media, then escape through the tunnel system. If successful, the operation would have been the most significant propaganda victory of the entire war. The death of the commanding general would have demonstrated that no American was safe anywhere in Vietnam, while the method, a lone Vietnamese woman penetrating American security and killing their most important commander, would have been a devastating blow to American credibility. But the plan required something that Lan had never needed before: luck. She made it into the firebase. She positioned herself for the shot. She waited for Westmoreland to enter her kill zone, but at the critical moment, her position was compromised by something completely outside her control: a random mortar attack by a different Viet Cong unit that had no knowledge of her mission. The explosion that killed her was friendly fire, a 120mm mortar round that landed directly on her concealment position. The irony was bitter. After surviving hundreds of American attempts to kill her, she died because her own side didn't know she was there. Westmoreland never knew how close he had come to death. The official after-action report listed one enemy KIA from the mortar attack, with no mention of the rifle found in the rubble or the implications of what that rifle represented. Lan died on February 15, 1968. 3 days before her 20th birthday. She had been active as a sniper for exactly 2 years, 7 months, and 14 days. In that time, she had killed 79 American soldiers and wounded 30. She had forced changes to American military doctrine, consumed enormous resources in counter-sniper operations, and created a psychological climate that contributed to the declining American will to continue the war. But those numbers only tell part of her story. Chapter 10. The Hidden Legacy. The true impact of Lan's operations wasn't discovered until decades after the war ended. Psychological studies of Vietnam veterans in the 1980s and 1990s revealed patterns that psychiatrists couldn't initially explain: specific phobias related to being watched, hypervigilance behaviors that persisted for decades after combat ended, and recurring nightmares about invisible enemy. Further investigation
revealed that these symptoms were significantly more common among veterans who had served in areas where Lan was known to operate. The psychological impact of her campaign had been so severe that it created lasting trauma in soldiers who had never even seen her. More importantly, analysis of declassified military documents revealed that fear of sniper attacks in general, and Lan specifically, had influenced American tactical decisions at every level. Operations were planned around avoiding sniper threat. Resources were allocated based on protecting against sniper attacks. Entire strategic initiatives were modified because commanders were afraid of giving enemy snipers opportunities for high-profile kills. The woman who had started as a village girl seeking revenge for her murdered family had ended up influencing the strategic direction of a superpower's foreign policy. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her legacy was hidden in the classified sections of military archives that weren't opened until then. Lan's techniques, her training methods, her psychological operations, all of it was studied, analyzed, and incorporated into American military doctrine. Military developed in the 1970s and 1980s. Were based largely on techniques that had been pioneered by Lan and her instructors in the Q-Chi tunnels. The psychological operations methods that became standard American practice were adaptations of the Long Fear campaign that she had used against the 3rd Battalion. In a final irony, the woman who had fought so effectively against American forces became the foundation for training the next generation of American soldiers. Her methods were so effective that even her enemies adopted them. Chapter 11. The Cover-Up and the Revelation. The American government didn't acknowledge it because admitting that a teenage girl had been so effective against their military would have been politically embarrassing. James Nguyen began researching sniper operations during the Vietnam War for a book about unconventional warfare tactics. His investigation led him to classified documents that had been declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, but had never been properly analyzed. What he found was the complete operational file on target designation Ghost. The codename American Intelligence had assigned to Lan. The file contained everything: photographs, ballistics reports, psychological profiles, after-action reports from every engagement, transcripts of intercepted communications, and most remarkably, a complete timeline of her operations compiled by American intelligence. The Americans had known more about Lan than even her own commanders. They had tracked her movements, predicted her targets, understood her methods, and documented every aspect of her campaign. They had been watching her almost as closely as she had been watching them. Nguyen's book, The Ghost of Q-Chi, Vietnam's Most Effective Sniper, was published in 1995. And immediately became controversial. Veterans groups accused him of glorifying enemy combatants. Military historians questioned whether one individual could have had such a significant impact. Government officials suggested that the documents might have been propaganda rather than factual reports, but the evidence was overwhelming. Cross-referencing Vietnamese and American sources, interviewing surviving participants from both sides, analyzing ballistics evidence and battlefield archaeology, everything confirmed the basic facts of Lan's story. The most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source: the personal diary of Captain Robert Manning, the CIA operative who had been in charge of the American effort to locate and eliminate. Chapter 12. The Hunter's Confession. Manning had been a professional soldier for 15 years when he was assigned to Task Force Hunter in 1967. He had served in Korea, participated in special operations in Laos, and trained with some of the best snipers in the world. He was confident that locating and eliminating one Vietnamese woman would be a straightforward assignment. His diary entries from the first few months are professional and optimistic. He analyzes her techniques, develops counter strategies, coordinates with other units, and expresses confidence that the mission will be completed successfully. But as the months passed and the body count mounted, the tone of his entries changed dramatically. October 15, 1967. She's not fighting like anyone I've ever encountered. Every time we think we understand her methods, she changes them. Every time we develop a counter strategy, she adapts. It's like fighting a ghost that learns from every encounter. November 3, 1967. Lost Henderson today, clean shot through the head at 800 meters. That should have been impossible with the equipment we know she's using. Either our intelligence about her weapons is wrong, or she's capable of things that shouldn't be possible. December 12, 1967. I'm starting to understand why the Vietnamese call her Ma Lai, evil spirit. She doesn't just kill people, she makes them afraid to live. The psychological impact of her operations is more devastating than the actual casualty. January 8, 1968, had a clear shot at her yesterday, 2,000 meters, perfect visibility. Stationary target. She was examining something through binoculars and didn't see me approach. I had her in my crosshairs for maybe 10 seconds. Could have ended this entire nightmare with one bullet, but I hesitated. I don't know why. By the time I took the shot, she was gone. The final entry, dated February 16, 1968. One day after Lan's death, was the most revealing. She's dead, killed by friendly fire during the Tet fighting. Should feel relief, satisfaction, closure. Instead, I feel like I've lost something important. She was the most worthy opponent I've ever faced. Fighting her made me better at what I do, even though she was trying to kill me. Strange to mourn an enemy, but that's what I'm doing. The war will continue, but it won't be the same. There will never be another like her. Manning's admission that he had hesitated when he had the opportunity to kill her raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Was it professional respect for a skilled opponent? Was it unconscious recognition that killing her would end the challenge that was defining his own purpose? Or was it something more complex? A psychological connection that had developed between hunter and hunted. The diary doesn't provide answers, but it does reveal the extent to which Lan had affected even the people trying to kill her. In the decades since the war ended, she has become a legend that transcends the historical facts of her life. In Vietnam, she is remembered as a national hero, a young woman who defended her country against foreign invaders with courage and skill that inspired a generation. Schools are named after her, statues commemorate her sacrifice. Her story is taught as an example of how determination and intelligence can overcome superior firepower. In America, her legacy is more complicated. Military historians study her techniques, sniper schools analyze her method. Veterans who served in Vietnam have mixed reactions to her memory. Respect for her skills, anger about the soldiers she killed, and a grudging admiration for her effectiveness. But questions remain. Despite decades of investigation, researchers have never been able to identify all the people who helped her operations. Vietnamese government records from the period are incomplete. American intelligence files remain partially classified. Many of the people who might have provided answers are dead. Some historians believe that the network that supported her was larger and more sophisticated than even the declassified documents suggest. They point to operations that required intelligence and resources beyond what a regional Viet Cong unit should have been able to provide. They note techniques and equipment that seem to have come from sources outside Vietnam entirely. The most intriguing theory is that Lan was being supported not just by local Vietnamese forces, but by international advisors from China, the Soviet Union, or even Cuba. Her training was more sophisticated than anything the Viet Cong had previously demonstrated. Her equipment was often better than what regular Vietnamese forces were using. Her psychological operations showed understanding of American culture that would have been difficult for local operatives to acquire. But there's no definitive proof, and the people who might have been involved aren't talking. The other enduring mystery involves her personal motivation. While her desire for revenge against the Americans who killed her family is understandable, the evolution of her mission from personal vendetta to strategic psychological warfare suggests influences beyond simple revenge. Was she acting primarily on her own initiative, or was she following orders from higher command? Did she develop her sophisticated techniques through her own experimentation, or was she implementing strategies developed by others? Was she primarily a soldier following orders, or was she a strategic thinker who understood the broader implications of her actions? Her personality, her private thoughts, her personal relationships, all of these remain largely unknown. The people who knew her best died in the war, or have chosen not to speak about their experiences. What we do know is that she changed the nature of warfare itself. The techniques she pioneered, the psychological operations she developed, the strategic thinking she demonstrated, all of these have influenced military doctrine around the world. Modern sniper training programs study her methods. Special operations forces analyze her tactics. Military psychologists examine her psychological operations techniques. In a war full of remarkable people who did extraordinary things, Nguyen Thi Lan stands out as someone who transcended the limitations that should have defined her possibility. A teenage village girl with no formal military training, became one of the most effective individual combatants in modern military history. Her story reminds us that in war, as in life, the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The ghost of Cu Chi died 56 years ago, but her influence on modern warfare, her impact on the people who fought against her, and her place in the hidden history of Vietnam ensure that she will never be forgotten. In the end, perhaps that's the most appropriate legacy for someone who spent her short life making sure that her enemies would never feel safe, never feel secure, and never forget that they were being watched by someone who understood them better than they understood themselves. The ghost is gone, but she left behind ghosts of her own.